Arab states, the UAE and Bahrain, are to formalize ties with Israel, to recognize Israel as a state officially, that is. Betrayal, however, doesn't have to be officiated to actually take place. That is what Iran is calling it, a betrayal of fellow Arab Muslims, the Palestinians, whose lands were usurped in the 1940s and again majorly in 1967. To Iran, it's a matter of principle as well as security. Jerusalem is holy land to Abrahamic followers, and it's been safeguarded since the dawn of Abrahamic religions by the Palestinians. Now, for non-Palestinian fellow Arabs to just hand it over to already occupying Zionist Israelis, that doesn't work for Palestinians, it doesn't work for Iranians, and it doesn't work for a predominantly Muslim Arab Middle East or West Asia. Now, why does Iran oppose the signing of the deal, the Abraham Accords, and what it suggests be done about it? Stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. Mr. Zarei is head of a strategic studies institute. He lists Iran's sequence of solutions.
Look,
the solution is that you get back peacefully what has been seized from you. But if it could not happen peacefully, you have to exercise politics, devise plans, meet with certain persons. What the leaders said was holding a referendum in Palestine, in which everyone can say what kind of government they want. If this option doesn't work, there would be no other choice than war and resistance. Someone has stolen a title deed from you. If by using a peaceful language and using political means you get nothing, you will have a third solution, which would be to fight for the deed. That is the solution for Palestine.
After World War II, Europe gave its Jewish problem to the Middle East, Palestine to be specific. And in doing so, it created a military base for the West and its remaining so-called Jews. For this to happen, villages were demolished and Palestinians died, were driven out or fenced in their homes. Arab nations were outraged. They will not forget. Yet several of their governments, allied to America and hence AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, are now out to give Israel the handshake. Why now? With just weeks left of US President Trump's term in office, who are they trying to please? According to Mr. Zarei, recognizing Israel is nothing new. It has only just surfaced. In fact, the advent of Israel or occupied Palestine went hand in hand with the Anglo-American practice of divide and rule, the last chapter.
It was the Arabs who founded Israel. It would be wrong to say that Israel was first established and then some Arabs supported it and some other opposed it. You can refer to the 1921 and 1923 documents. In those years, Israel had not even been established. The father of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz, submitted a letter saying Saudi Arabia recognized the Jews' right to establish a state in Palestine. So the Arabs established it, but the Saudis played a trick to show that they are a leading state in defending the cause of Palestine while they had themselves established Israel.
The very nature of Israel's birth has warranted division and weakening of the region. And Iran will certainly not stand for a yet increased Israeli presence in its immediate neighborhood. It would not do anyone in the region any good, implied Iranian President Rouhani. The rulers of the Emirates should know they are mistaken if they think they can buy security by getting closer to the enemies of Islam and Iran, he said, warning that if they want to open the path to Israel's presence in the region, they will be dealt with in a different manner. Talking of divide and rule, it doesn't have to be geographic. Since Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution and this country severing its ties with the US, America has portrayed Iran as a scarecrow that only America can save the Arabs from. Now that the US is set to retract from the region, Arabs are leaning towards Israel in opposition to Iran, while at the same time winning brownie points with the US or helping Donald Trump back into office. That is one analysis. To examine the truth of it, I recommend reference to authority. Mr. Ruivaron, with a wealth of books on what really happened in Palestine, has something to say on every detail to do with the Middle East.
The US is seeking to block China's growth. The US faces limitations in concentration, and if it wants to focus heavily on China, it would not have time to operate in the Middle East. What is happening now would clear the way for the US to quit the region. In other words, Israel, which has been dependent on the US, would become self-reliant. The US is creating a geographical depth for Israel and filling its financial needs in order to have sufficient time to focus on its own priorities.
I asked what the recognition of Israel would mean for Muslim unity, as Muslims are united on the issue of Palestine. Mr. Qudjumi is the Hamas representative in Tehran, the Iranian capital. Let's hear him out.
I understand that even the Arab League stance was very, very weird and very strange, and it is even a new, though they were never involved really contextual with the Palestinian issue, but still they were abide by what's so-called the Arab Initiative in 2002. Such a deal between Emirate regime, Bahrain regime, and Israel is launching the death decision of so-called Arab Initiative, 2002.
We popped out to see how the man on the street would express his feelings.
About the recent normalization of relations with Israel, I have a feeling of betrayal. How can they betray their own kind for an occupying regime?
The Arab governments did not do anything correct, and they betrayed their own nations, Palestine and other oppressed nations in the region.
We never give money to Palestinians. We actually pay for the survival of our ideals and our religion, Islam. We finance the reinforcement of Palestine and Hezbollah in favor of the region.
At the age of awakening, and since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, Iran is helping oppressed nations.
It shows their position of weakness. It coincides with the US presidential election. Mr. Trump is trying to save himself from a quagmire.
The agreement would reduce the UAE and other prospective Arab signatories to nothing more than an Israeli colony. Now other Arab states are said to be waiting in line to normalize relations with Israel, while Turkey has opposed the deal. My scholarly interviewee appeared surprised to hear of some other Arab states explaining why the likes of Kuwait can't readily recognize Israel.
The nations whose political establishment is not essentially accountable do such things more easily. The UAE and Bahrain are among them. Oman and Qatar may also follow suit, but I don't think Kuwait would be like them due to its parliamentary system since 1960s. The political establishment in Kuwait cannot do so because of the parliament barrier.
The people are the roots and tree trunk that hold the resistance up. Hence, non-democratic regional states should fear the inspiration it may instill in their own people. Israel is an uncomfortable fit in the region. It has both publicly threatened to attack Iran's nuclear facilities and opposes the nuclear deal that limits Iran's nuclear program, a program that Iran has maintained as peaceful all along. Must note, the UN nuclear watchdog has confirmed Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal 15 times. As for Israel, the cancer node, as Iran sees it, has an estimated 80 to 90 nuclear warheads and enough fissile material for 200 warheads in total. Israel is not an NPT or Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty member, unlike Iran. Israel is secretive about its nuclear activities and is said to have developed a nuclear triad to deliver its nuclear weapons. Also, according to reports, Israel maintains an offensive biological and chemical weapons program. Israel is also believed to possess an arsenal of 25 to 100 nuclear-capable Jericho 2 and Jericho 3 missiles that are likely road and rail mobile. As for Israel's air-based nuclear forces, again, it is estimated that the entity maintains 30 nuclear gravity bombs to be delivered by aircraft, and so forth. And yet, Israel, unwanted really by the neighbors and badly run internally, is in a precarious situation.
Trump and Netanyahu, they are in deep crisis today. They wanted to come up from their crisis through such a deal. That is one. The second thing, no, there is a strategic context for that. And the strategic context is that the American administrations, since the inception of this Israeli regime, they were guaranteeing the security of this regime and surpassing of its power over the whole components of the region. Hence, one has to think, why now? Because we all know, as Dr. Zarif was saying, that this deal is among an old allies.
In recent months, Israelis have demonstrated repeatedly in protest to Prime Minister Netanyahu's corruption. They are past caring to occupy 30% of the West Bank. They don't want it. 61 to 75% of residents are dissatisfied with Netanyahu's performance, according to polls. In fact, Israel is in one of the worst political, economic and social situations in its 70 years in the region. This could have been a golden opportunity for Arabs to secure the rights of their Palestinian brothers. But instead, they are rewarding Netanyahu where his own people wouldn't.
Apart from Mr. Trump's election bid and Mr. Netanyahu's political ambitions, as protests have been continuing for 2 months in Israel and he would need to convince people to ignore his corruption charges, the main reason for this issue is not instantaneous. Rather, it's a long-term issue.
It is simply a new approachment to threaten the resistance movements and to threaten Iran, which is in the resistance idea, to besiege Iran more and more, to make more pressure over Iran if we are talking about a regional context.
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Arab states are giving way just as the UN and some European countries have recognized the rights of the Palestinian people as the BDS movement in the West grows rapidly. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions. It is a Palestinian-led movement to secure for Palestinians the freedom, justice and equality enjoyed by any other human being.
The United Nations, even European Union, who are saying today that we are going to recognize the Palestinian state, they have had to do it. They have to do it much 72 years ago. They had to empower the Palestinian state. They were always dealing with so-called Israeli state, and because of their support and deal, Israel today is a very advanced country. And why? Because of their behavior. They didn't behave the same with the Palestinians.
All said, Iran will not restrict itself in defending the country's security. In fact, it sees itself responsible for regional security too. Iran was stranded when Ba'athist Iraq imposed an 8-year war on it in the 1980s. Iran practically fought a world war on its person. And it has lived through the US's hardest ever sanctions to learn that indigenous weaponry is its lifeblood. Plenty more to say, but it's time for other media outlets to see what they have to say. So I'll give you Shahrzad now.
Hi, my name is Shahrzad Manucheri, and we'll be reviewing the latest update on Iran's stance on the so-called peace deals between Israel and the Arab states. Kashmir Observer states Palestine burning in fire of Arab rulers' treason, says Iran. Iran says half a century after Israel's arson attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the innocent Palestine is still burning in the fire of Israeli incursion and some Arab rulers' treason. It's been 51 years since Zionist extremists set fire to Al-Aqsa Mosque, the first qibla of Muslim people, a common heritage of human beings, and a symbol of unity amongst all monotheistic religions, says Iran's Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh. The innocent Palestine is still burning in the fire of Zionist regime's impudence and incursion and the treason of certain Arab rulers, he added in a tweet. On August 21, 1969, the mosque was set on fire by an Australian settler in coordination with Israeli officials and military forces. The fire gutted the southeastern wing of the mosque. In an article by the Washington Post, we witnessed the mirage of Trump's peace deals. The big deals trumpeted by the White House this month are not the victories for peace that Trump claims they are. Both the UAE and Bahrain already communicate and engage with Israel, and the three countries were not locked in anything close to conflict. The UAE-Israel strategic relationship was fueled by mutual fears of Iran and formalized by the United States, Karim Sajjadpour, a Middle East analyst, said. It's an example of Trump slapping his name on a hotel that was essentially already built. Boosters of the normalization see Israel's deepening ties with the Arab world as a positive development in the region, but there's no indication of what sort of real peace Palestinians chafing under Israeli occupation may gain from a handful of Persian Gulf states receiving Israeli ambassadors and new orders of U.S. military hardware. It is hard to identify a single point of progress concerning Israeli-Palestinian peace that is the result of U.S. intervention, noted Grace Wimberball of the Middle East Institute. Trump's international, pro-Israel policy has alienated the Palestinian Authority and challenged the U.S.'s ability to act as an impartial mediator. Beyond a clear diplomatic reevaluation of the Palestinian cause, the UAE's normalization of ties with Israel is unlikely to offer much more. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
Iran's military doctrine being defensive and deterrent, it prohibits dirty war. But manufacturing ballistic missiles is at the core of its defenses. Recently in August, the country unveiled 2 new missiles amid heightened tensions with the US. The Martyr Haj Qasem surface-to-surface ballistic missile has a 1,400-kilometer range, and the Martyr Abu Mahdi naval cruise missile has a 1,000-kilometer range. They're named after the 2 commanders martyred by the US almost as the clock ticked in 2020. Iran already possessed longer-range missiles, but these 2 will do to reach Israel and US bases across West Asia, should Iran be provoked.
This issue threatens even their own security. In the region, a serious dispute is underway between the Resistance Front and the US. Regarding Iran-US dispute, we downed their drone-fired missiles as a military base in Ain al-Assad, and they assassinated our general. Therefore, a war is underway between us. There is a conflict between us. We are powerful enough to engage in a conflict and manage our own issues. We are powerful enough to keep the US from launching any attack on us.
Contrary to the Zionist media propaganda, Iran is not out for blood, but it will not readily give blood either. For Palestine too, it would rather a peaceful solution. Iran suggested a referendum for all original Palestinians anywhere in the world, be they Muslim, Christian or Jewish, to vote on their fate. But that has been treated as no more than a pretty suggestion, and regional states are moving to change the political map of West Asia. But changing path and moving on doesn't necessarily mean moving up or even forward. Iran, for its part, is steadfast in strengthening the resistance in supporting the Palestinian cause. But now that may be harder, now that regional Muslim states are ganging up with Israel. Or will it be harder? Coming up, we have an answer.
یک جبهه مقاومت هم در منطقه شکل گرفته
A resistance front has taken shape in the region, giving rise to an equation in the region, known as deterrence. The equation is between Iran and the Zionist regime, between Lebanon and Israel, and also between other member states of resistance. Now the question is, if anything special has happened after the UAE and Bahrain made peace with Israel. Nothing has happened, as both were on the other side of the equation. All they did was to lay bare to relationship.
Some regional states may be siding with Israel, even handing over a Muslim Arab region to a Zionist Jewish state, but they are wary of signing on it. Perhaps Iran's Islamic revolution, following an Islamic awakening by the Palestinian issue, has served as a warning to them. They wouldn't want their own people further inspired.
I wanted to say that the one who is orchestrating everything, the master, regional master I'm saying, not the master is America. Okay, but the regional master is Saudis. They're doing everything, but they're not coming on the scene because of the legitimacy of the royal family within Saudi Arabia. This is very important for them. It's not because of Islam. It's not because of Palestine. Over there in Saudi Arabia, the main pillar of kingdomship is the religious seminary or religious, you could say, framework, and the royal family itself. So he has to put some people like Sudais to say something good in his favor. So accordingly, the other religious people will say yes. So they will never dare, I don't think that they will ever dare, till the coming 5-6 years, to open an official relations, but they will do every dirty job.
The state of affairs in pre-revolutionary Iran is too complicated to say much on here in limited words. But in short, Iran voted against the UN partition plan for Palestine in 1947, and after the establishment of Israel, Iran opposed its acceptance as a member state into the organization, the UN. Nonetheless, Iran became the second Muslim-majority country after Turkey to give Israel de facto recognition. That was in 1950, but it was kept quiet. But the truth will out. A decade later, an abrupt question rattled a careful press conference with the then king, Mohammad Reza Shah. Is it true that Iran has recognized Israel? Asked a personality called Abdurrahman of the Kayhan Daily. It took the Shah a while to respond to the yes-no question. He finally said Iran has long recognized Israel as a de facto state. That is nothing new. Many Muslim countries, such as Turkey, have done the same. At the time, in the 1950s and 60s, Iran felt threatened by the Soviet-sponsored pan-Arab nationalism, which boycotted the occupiers of Jerusalem, Palestine, with nationalist slogans. During the Cold War, the ongoing Cold War between America and Russia, the then Soviet Union, Iran was an important ally to the US. Rich in oil, Iran had control of access to the Persian Gulf, and automatic friendship with the US put Iran in alliance with Israel. From Israel's viewpoint, Iran fit into the periphery doctrine, by which Israel tried to cultivate relations with non-Arab enemies of its enemies.
We have two perspectives about regional developments. One dates from before the Islamic Revolution and the other one belongs to post-revolution. Before the Islamic Revolution, the entire region was in US hands. Furthermore, the entire world, Russia, the UN, Europe, the US and their satellite states were all under the Zionist influence. They all reiterated that Israel had to be established on the Holy Land and be a strain on Muslims in that area.
But Iran's Muslim and secular forces were at odds over the Palestinian issue, as were the people and government. When the country erupted in 1979 and Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in France to take the reins, Iran joined the Arab axis in fighting Israel. He returned on February the 1st, and on February the 18th, he severed relations with Israel.
Question is again, what the benefits has been gained by the nations, I'm not saying Palestinians, by the nations who has normalized, who's their governments normalized with Israel. Nothing. Look at the situation, economic and political situation in Egypt. Look at the economic and political situation in Jordan. It is more deteriorated than before the situation when they were having no relation with Israel, when they were confronting Israel in dignity.
That's it for today. Far from the tragic end so many have met. We'll be back next week at the same times and each week after, so do watch. And don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.